Okay, so rule number 2. Maintain intellectual integrity. So what do we mean by that? Well, we can break it down into 2 basic sub-commandments. First, thou shalt not steal. And second, thou shalt not make stuff up. So, thou shalt not steal. Well, we all know that we shouldn't plagiarize, right? I would hope so by this point. However, I'm not sure that everybody understands what actually counts as plagiarism. Obviously, you can't just copy or cut and paste somebody else's work without giving credit and trying to claim it as your own. Beyond that, plagiarism can actually include just copying the structure of another paper. So for example, if you've got like a friend who's taken this course before, and you take their work that they've done in the previous semester and just sort of paraphrase everything and then turn it in as your own, then that also counts as plagiarism. Something else that I've seen get called on plagiarism once was if you build your paper out of large block quotes and chewing gum or something. Basically just cited and cited and cited, and there wasn't an original idea in the paper. It was about 85% other people's words. Even if they were cited, why would you expect to get credit for that? Now you can use citations and quotations to support your ideas, but just keep in mind that these are not your ideas. These belong to somebody else. So, while we're on the topic of quotations, let's talk a little bit more about some writing style kind of stuff. So when you're citing other literature, as a general rule, it's much better to paraphrase and cite than it is to use direct quotations. That's especially true if you can summarize, a major argument in just like a sentence or two. For example, perceived surveillance, whether it's actually occurring or not, is a form of power and discipline, which is Foucault, 1975. The fact is, Foucault spent about 50 pages describing this concept in his book Discipline and Punish. However, the gist of it is there in that sentence. Similarly, if you have a bunch of authors who have written on the same topic, you don't need to pull quotations from each one of them. Rather, paraphrase what they're saying in common, and then cite them all accordingly. So narrative theory in counseling holds that people's lived experience is storied. Friedman and Combs, 1990, White and Epstein, 1991, and Perry and Doan, 1994. Right, those are the 3 sources that I'm going to cite here. Now, they've all said that in their own way, but that in general is what they are saying in common. Also, don't use a direct quotation when authors are just talking generally. For example, these definitions highlight some of the self-focused emotional, motivational, and behavioral components of self-forgiveness. Cornish and Wade, 2015, page 97. Well, that doesn't really require or deserve a quotation. It's a general statement about some definitions that they made earlier in the article. The best time to use a direct quotation is when the author has stated something in a particularly eloquent or succinct or unique way. For example, to omit the revision process is to leave clients in a state of psychological freefall. Alternately stated, it is to leave them outside of a story. That's Perry and Doan, 1994, page 45. This is a quote that I actually really love. Paraphrasing it would not do it justice. It would lose something of its sentiment. The term, leave them outside of a story, is very well stated, I believe. And it's an important point about deconstructing client stories in narrative therapy. And then finally, when you're using a direct quotation, don't just quote someone and drop the mic and walk away. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Thoreau, 1851. Peace out. Wait, what? You can't just let that hang there. It's always a good idea to follow up your quotation with a sentence or two to unpack it. You need to explain why that quote is important in the context of whatever it is you're writing about, and how it contributes to the points that you're making. If you can expand on these quotations that you've selected, you'll avoid the charge of plagiarism because you're incorporating this idea into your own ideas. And then we have, thou shalt not make stuff up. Sometimes what happens with novice researchers is that the researcher gets committed to a particular result, and that result doesn't necessarily pan out. in the study. What they found wasn't necessarily what they expected to find. And so the hypothesis that they generated, the alternative hypothesis, was not supported. So at this point, some novice researchers might feel pressure to make something happen. However, this is dishonest research. Keep in mind, the goal of research is not to prove, but to discover. So in that light, there's no such thing as wrong results. Instead, you get the results that you get, and then your job as a researcher is trying to figure it out and explain why you've gotten these results. And then, in some cases, reporting that your hypothesis was actually unconfirmed is also valuable information. And can be worth submitting anyway. I thought this was going to happen. Turns out it didn't happen. No need to keep, pursuing this course of study. So let's conclude by talking about what happens after you've written up your research. So the best thing to do with your study is to submit it to a refereed journal. These journals use what is known as the peer review process. So when the editor receives your manuscript, they'll send it out to typically 3 reviewers. These are usually experts in the field, either in methodology or in the content area of the study. The reviewers will read the article and they'll provide feedback for the author and sort of recommendation to the editor of whether or not to actually publish the article. Now, the review process is generally a blind process, meaning that the reviewers don't have any idea who the authors are, and the authors don't know who's reviewing their articles. That identities are kept secret, and the editor is the one who manages the manuscript, sending it back and forth. So at the end of the review process, the editor collects all of the information from all of the different reviewers and looks at it, and comes to a decision on whether or not to publish the article. Typically, there are 3 options that an editor will have. 1, reject the article. If it's just not right for the journal, doesn't fit the journal's scope, or if there are major substantial problems with either the methodology or something else in the article, then editors will reject an article. The second and most frequent option is revise and resubmit. This means that the article shows promise, but it still needs quite a bit of work. Third option is to accept the article for publication, and this may be with or without suggested revisions. Being accepted without revisions is very rare. It means that your article is perfect as it is.
Now we are so happy we do the dance of joy! Hey!
More commonly, they'll ask you to make some minor changes, but they're committed to publishing this article. In each case, the feedback and suggestions are passed along to the authors so that they can improve their articles. So the peer review is actually a gatekeeping process. It protects the integrity of the knowledge that's being put out into the field.
You shall not pass!
It's very difficult to get a lot of BS by the editor and 3 peer reviewers who are experts. But let's say, by some chance, you manage to slip your BS article by the reviewers and out into publication, and it happens sometimes. Well, now you're not just dealing, with 3 or 4 people reading your article. You're dealing with your entire field reading your article. And there are definitely people out there in the field who will not hesitate to call you out on your BS in not very nice ways and totally shred your article apart. Which, of course, ruins your reputation as a researcher in the field. But let's assume a best-case scenario. You've done BS research, you got it by the reviewers, it's been published, and nobody catches on. Well, what's going to happen with this article? If people are interested, they're going to try and replicate your study to build on it. And when their findings don't agree with your findings, then in the best case scenario, they'll consider your research to be an error or, just a fluke. In worst case scenario, they'll call you out on your BS. So you won't build up much of a reputation that way. Overall, it really doesn't pay to make things up in research. On the other hand, if you're caught plagiarizing or you're caught making things up or you're caught doing some kind of unethical research practice, word gets around. You abuse the trust of this larger research community, and eventually you're going to get, blacklisted. And journal editors are not going to want to touch your research articles. And that's going to affect tenure and promotion or your ability to even find a job after you graduate. So, I mean, if you want to have an academic career, you really do need to be ethical.